The third day of dog-sitting was when everything changed. Not that the first 2 days with Nathan and Elise's 3 pampered poodles had been uneventful. Baxter had already chewed one of my slippers, and Daisy had staged a brief but memorable escape into the neighbor's yard. But it was on that third morning that my life tilted on its axis, though I wouldn't understand the magnitude of the shift until much later. I'd settled into a comfortable routine in my son's sprawling suburban home, so different from my modest apartment with its carefully tended potted plants and shelves of well-worn books. 40 years as a librarian had left me with a passion for the written word and an organized mind, both of which seemed at odds with the chaotic energy of 3 dogs unaccustomed to my more measured pace. "Steady, Winston," I murmured to the largest of the 3, an enormous gray standard poodle who had the disconcerting habit of leaning his entire weight against my legs when he wanted attention. "We'll go outside in a minute." The kitchen in Nathan and Elise's house was all gleaming stainless steel and pristine white countertops, beautiful but intimidating. I felt constantly aware of leaving fingerprints or water spots, despite Nathan's assurances before they left that I should make myself at home. "Really, Mom, just relax," he'd said, his hand on my shoulder, that familiar smile warming his face. "Mi casa es su casa for the next 2 weeks." But it didn't feel like my house, not with its soaring ceilings and modern art pieces that I secretly thought looked like accidents rather than intentional creations. Not with Elise's subtle but constant reminders of the proper way to load their dishwasher and the specific temperature at which the thermostat should be kept. I poured my morning coffee into one of the delicate bone china mugs Elise reserved for guests, still not quite comfortable using their everyday items despite my son's assurances. From the kitchen window, I could see the perfectly manicured backyard where the dogs would soon be romping. It was a beautiful spring morning, sunlight dappling the expensive patio furniture through the newly leafed oak trees. "All right, you 3, I said, turning to the expectant canines. "Let's go outside." The chaos that followed was predictable by now. Excited barking, tangled leashes, the mad dash through the back door. Winston pulled so hard that I nearly lost my balance on the back steps, my coffee sloshing over the rim of the cup and onto the sleeve of my cardigan. "Winston, heel!" I commanded, with as much authority as I could muster, though the massive poodle paid me no more attention than he would a passing butterfly. Once in the yard, the dogs scattered in 3 directions. Baxter to chase imaginary prey along the fence line, Daisy to roll ecstatically in a patch of grass, and Winston to investigate the flower beds with alarming interest. "No, Winston, not the hydrangeas." Too late. The enormous dog had already charged through Elise's prized blue hydrangeas, sending a cascade of petals floating to the ground like botanical confetti. Sighing, I set my coffee cup on the patio table and hurried to extract him before further damage could be done. That's when I heard the crash from inside the house. My heart stuttered. I'd closed the back door, hadn't I? I was certain I had. But apparently not completely, because when I turned, I saw it standing ajar, the unmistakable sound of something falling or being knocked over, echoing from within. "Oh no," I muttered, hurrying back to the house with Winston reluctantly in tow. "Daisy, Baxter, stay," I called over my shoulder, though I had little hope of being obeyed. Inside, the culprit was immediately apparent. Coco, the small chocolate toy poodle I'd somehow overlooked in the morning chaos, had managed to knock over a tall, slender vase in the hallway. Water pooled on the hardwood floor, white lilies scattered like casualties of a tiny domestic disaster. "Coco," I sighed, securing Winston's leash to a doorknob before approaching the scene of the crime. "What have you done?" The diminutive dog had the grace to look ashamed, backing away from the mess with her tail between her legs. I shooed her gently toward the back door, where the others were now clustering, curious about the commotion. After securing all 4 dogs safely in the yard, I returned to assess the damage. The vase hadn't broken, thankfully, but water had seeped between the floorboards, and several lily stamens had left orange pollen stains on the pale wood. I hurried to the kitchen for towels, dabbing at the water and gently blotting the pollen stains. Elise would notice, of course. She noticed everything. But perhaps if I acted quickly enough, the damage would be minimal. As I worked, I noticed something odd. The water had run in a small rivulet toward the office door, which stood slightly ajar and disappeared underneath. Concerned about damage to the expensive hardwood, I pushed the door open wider and knelt to wipe up the trail of water. That's when I saw it. The water had seeped under the large bookcase that dominated one wall of Nathan's home office, and appeared to be pooling behind it rather than in front. Curious, I ran my hand along the base of the bookcase and discovered a small gap between it and the wall, just enough for water to trickle through. That's strange, I murmured to myself. The bookcase looked built in, part of the office's custom design. Why would there be a gap? Curiosity, the occupational hazard of a lifelong librarian, got the better of me. I set down my towel and examined the bookcase more carefully. It was filled with business books, family photos, and the various awards and recognitions from Nathan's career in finance. Nothing unusual. But when I gently pressed against one side, I felt a slight give. The bookcase moved. Not much, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to confirm it wasn't actually built into the wall as it appeared. Well, that's odd, I said aloud, pushing a bit harder. The bookcase swung outward slightly, revealing a narrow space behind it, a hidden alcove of sorts. My first thought was practical. I needed to make sure the water hadn't damaged anything important in this hidden space. My second thought, following immediately on the heels of the first, was that I was violating my son's privacy by investigating further. I hesitated, one hand still on the edge of the bookcase. Nathan and Elise were entitled to their secrets, their private spaces. I was here to care for their dogs, not to snoop through their belongings. But the librarian in me, the part that had spent decades organizing information and solving research puzzles, couldn't resist the mystery of a hidden compartment behind a bookcase. It was like something from one of the mystery novels I so enjoyed. I'm just checking for water damage, I justified to myself, pushing the bookcase a few inches further. The space behind was dark, but in the sliver of light from the office window, I could make out something red. A folder or portfolio of some kind, standing upright against the wall. I reached in, intending only to check if it was wet from the spilled water. When I pulled it out, my heart nearly stopped. It was a bright red folder, expensive-looking, and sealed with a black elastic band, and on the front, printed in bold black letters, was my name, Grace Winters. But that wasn't all. Below my name was a photograph, a recent one, taken at Nathan's birthday dinner just 2 months ago. Me, smiling, unaware that someone had captured my image to be used for what, exactly? I stood frozen, the red folder in my trembling hands, water forgotten, dogs barking distantly in the yard. Why would my son have a hidden folder with my name and photograph on it? What could possibly be inside that needed to be concealed behind a false bookcase? A dozen explanations raced through my mind, each more improbable than the last. A surprise party? Financial planning to help with my retirement? Some kind of family history project? But none of these explanations accounted for the secrecy, the hidden compartment, the locked office that I'd only entered because of Coco's mishap with the vase. I ran my fingers over the elastic band securing the folder. To open it would be a clear invasion of privacy, but it was my name on the front, my photograph. Whatever this was, it concerned me directly. The dogs barking grew more insistent, pulling me from my troubled thoughts. I needed to let them back in, clean up the remaining water, restore order before making any decisions about this unsettling discovery. Carefully, I replaced the folder exactly as I'd found it and eased the bookcase back into position. The dogs could wait a few more minutes while I finished cleaning up the water. I worked methodically, mind racing, the image of the red folder with my name blazing in my thoughts like a warning sign. By the time I let the dogs back in, I'd made my decision. I would wait until evening when the dogs were settled. Then I would return to the office, retrieve the folder, and discover exactly why my son was keeping secrets about me. Little did I know that behind that simple red cover lay revelations that would shatter my understanding of my family, my past, and my future, all in a single night. The day crawled by with excruciating slowness. I went through the motions of dog care, feeding, walking, playing, but my mind remained fixated on the red folder hidden behind the bookcase. Each time I passed Nathan's office door, my steps slowed, drawn by the magnetic pull of that concealed secret bearing my name. Not yet, I whispered to myself. Wait until evening. By 6 o'clock, I had fed the dogs their dinner and settled them in the family room with their favorite TV show, some program featuring animals that kept them entranced for at least an hour. With a cup of tea to steady my nerves, I finally returned to Nathan's office, closing the door softly behind me. The room felt different now, charged with potential revelations. Family photos smiled down from the walls. Nathan's graduation, his wedding to Elise, the four of us at Christmas last year. Normal, happy moments that suddenly seemed suspect in light of hidden compartments and secret files. I moved directly to the bookcase, no longer hesitating. Finding the edge that had yielded earlier, I pressed firmly, and the case swung outward a few inches. The red folder remained exactly where I'd left it, as if waiting for my return. This time, I pulled it out with purpose and carried it to Nathan's desk. Under the glow of his expensive desk lamp, I removed the elastic band and opened the cover. The first page nearly stopped my heart. Last Will and Testament of Walter Edmund Winters. My Uncle Walter? I hadn't thought about him in years. My father's eccentric older brother who had disappeared into the Vermont countryside decades ago, surfacing only for the occasional family funeral. The last I'd heard, he was living as a recluse in some historic property, writing obscure historical papers that no one read. The date on the will caught my eye. Just 6 months ago. Walter had died? Why hadn't anyone told me? I turned the page, scanning the formal legal language until I reached the distribution of assets. Then I had to sit down, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. All assets, property, and holdings valued at approximately $4. 7 million USD to my sole surviving blood relative, my great-niece Grace Eleanor Winters. $4.7 million? Uncle Walter had that kind of money? And he'd left it all to me? Disbelief gave way to confusion. If this was true, why hadn't I been notified? Why hadn't Nathan told me I'd inherited a fortune? The next document provided the first clue, a certified letter from the law firm of Braddock & Sons, addressed to Nathan, dated 3 months ago. It formally notified him, as my next of kin, that all attempts to contact me directly had failed, and requested his assistance in locating me to inform me of my inheritance. Failed to contact me? I'd lived in the same apartment for 15 years. My phone number hadn't changed in 2 decades. I was hardly in hiding. Beneath this letter lay something that sent ice through my veins. A handwritten note in what I recognized as Elise's precise script. Do not forward. Grace must not know until plan is implemented. All calls from Vermont area codes to be intercepted. My hands began to shake. They had deliberately kept this inheritance from me. But why? The answer emerged as I continued through the folder. Financial statements revealed that Nathan and Elise were not the successful power couple they portrayed. Their mortgage was underwater. Credit card statements showed debts exceeding $150,000. Investment reports documented catastrophic losses in high-risk ventures. A foreclosure notice dated just 2 weeks ago explained that proceedings would begin next month. My son and his wife were on the verge of financial collapse. Deeper in the folder, the situation grew darker. A document titled Project Inheritance outlined a detailed plan with bullet points and timelines. Create power of attorney documents, completed. Obtain Grace's identification, completed. Secure signature samples, completed. Contact executor as Grace, in progress. Claim inheritance before contestation deadline, scheduled. With growing horror, I found a forged power of attorney with what appeared to be my signature, but wasn't. Bank account details in my name that I'd never opened. A photocopy of my driver's license that had gone missing last month and that I'd had to replace. Then, the most disturbing item of all, a receipt for a gray wig styled like my hair, theatrical makeup for aging effects, and a woman's name and phone number. Angela Weaver, impersonation consultant. The Caribbean trip was a lie. The anniversary celebration was fiction. According to the timeline, Nathan and Elise were currently in Vermont, preparing to have this Angela person impersonate me and claim my inheritance. I sat back, my tea long forgotten and cold. The dog's program had ended, their barking in the other room a distant concern compared to the betrayal laid out before me in meticulous detail. My own son was planning to steal millions from me, to commit fraud using my identity, to claim an inheritance that was rightfully mine before I even knew it existed. I thought of Nathan as a little boy, his serious eyes looking up at me as I read him bedtime stories. The teenager who'd helped me through my husband's death, holding my hand at the funeral. The young man who'd sworn he'd always take care of me. What had happened to that son? Had money troubles corrupted him so completely? Or was this Elise's influence? Either way, the folder in my hands represented not just a hidden fortune, but the death of my trust in my only child. I gathered the documents with trembling fingers, my mind already racing ahead. According to the timeline, I had less than 2 weeks before the contestation deadline, whatever that meant in legal terms. Less than 2 weeks to stop my own son from stealing millions of dollars from me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 40 years helping people find information, and now information had found me in the most devastating way possible. As I closed the folder, a small business card fell out. Harrison Braddock, estate attorney, with a Vermont phone number. The lawyer handling Uncle Walter's estate, and apparently the man Nathan planned to deceive with an imposter version of me. I slipped the card into my pocket. Tomorrow would require clear thinking and decisive action, but one thing was certain. I wouldn't be the passive victim my son assumed I would be. I may have been just a librarian to them, but they were about to discover that knowledge truly is power, and I had just acquired both. Morning found me at Nathan and Elise's kitchen table, the red folder open beside a fresh cup of coffee, a legal pad covered in my neat handwriting, and all 3 dogs snoring contentedly at my feet. I'd slept little, my mind cataloging and cross-referencing the information like the organized librarian I'd been for 4 decades. By dawn, I'd formulated the beginnings of a plan. First priority, secure my legal right to the inheritance without alerting Nathan and Elise to my discovery. This would require finesse and discretion, 2 qualities I'd cultivated through years of helping researchers locate sensitive information without broadcasting their interests to the entire library. I picked up my phone and dialed the number on Harrison Braddock's business card, angling my body toward the window to catch the early morning light. After 2 rings, a crisp, professional voice answered. Braddock & Sons, estate attorneys. How may I direct your call? I'd like to speak with Harrison Braddock, please, I replied, keeping my voice steady. Regarding the estate of Walter Edmund Winters. May I ask who's calling? I took a deep breath. This is Grace Winters, his great niece and apparently his heir. A brief pause. 1 moment, please. While waiting, I stroked Winston's silky head as he stirred at my feet. The normalcy of the gesture steadied me, a reminder that despite discovering my son's betrayal, the world continued turning. Ms. Winters? A deeper, older voice came on the line. This is Harrison Braddock. I've been attempting to reach you for months. I'm just learning that, I said carefully. It seems there's been some interference with your communications. Interference? His tone sharpened with professional interest. What kind of interference? It's complicated, Mr. Braddock, and not something I'd prefer to discuss over the phone. What I can tell you is that I only discovered Uncle Walter's passing and my inheritance yesterday, quite by accident. That's most irregular, he said. We sent certified letters to your address. We made numerous phone calls. Your son assured us he had informed you, but that you were dealing with health issues and preferred him to handle the preliminary matters. Health issues? The fabrications were worse than I'd imagined. Mr. Braddock, I'm in perfect health, and until yesterday, completely unaware of my inheritance. Furthermore, I continued, lowering my voice though there was no one to overhear, I have reason to believe there may be an attempt to fraudulently claim the inheritance using someone impersonating me. Silence stretched across the line, followed by the sound of papers rustling. Ms. Winters, these are serious allegations. We have protocols for identity verification precisely to prevent such situations. However, if what you're suggesting is true, we should meet in person immediately. I glanced at the timeline in the red folder. I believe my son and his wife are currently in Vermont, possibly meeting with your office this week. Yes, that's correct, he confirmed, surprise evident in his voice. Nathan Winters contacted us last week to schedule a meeting for tomorrow. He indicated he would be bringing you with him to complete the inheritance process. My heart raced. Mr. Braddock, the woman he brings will not be me. I see. His tone had shifted to one of grave concern. Ms. Winters, where are you currently located? I'm at my son's home in Connecticut, taking care of their dogs while they're supposedly on vacation in the Caribbean, a vacation that clearly isn't happening. Connecticut? He sounded thoughtful. That's approximately a 4-hour drive from our offices in Burlington. Would you be able to come to Vermont today, before your son's scheduled appointment tomorrow? I considered the logistics. The dogs would need care, but Nathan's regular dog walker came every afternoon. I could leave a note saying I had a doctor's appointment, be back before evening, and Nathan would never know I'd left the house. Yes, I can be there by early afternoon. Excellent. Bring multiple forms of identification. Driver's license, passport if you have one, social security card, anything with your photograph. We'll need to verify your identity conclusively. I understand. And Mr. Braddock? I hesitated. I'd prefer to handle this situation with as much discretion as possible. My son has clearly made some terrible choices, but he's still my son. Of course, he replied, his voice softening slightly. Family matters are always delicate. We'll proceed with appropriate sensitivity. After ending the call, I sat for a moment, absorbing the reality of what I was about to do. In one day, I had gone from dog-sitting to uncovering fraud to planning a covert trip to claim a multi-million-dollar inheritance, all while trying to navigate the heartbreaking betrayal of my only child. I looked down at the dogs, their trusting eyes gazing up at me. At least you three aren't plotting against me, I murmured, scratching behind Baxter's ears. With renewed determination, I made a quick list of necessities: identification documents, comfortable driving clothes, snacks for the road, and most importantly, the red folder with all its damning evidence. Within an hour, I had everything packed in my sensible handbag. I wrote a note for the dog walker explaining that I had a medical appointment and would return by evening, placed it prominently on the kitchen counter, and made sure the dogs had ample food and water. The regular walker had a key and would let herself in at 2 o'clock, by which time I would be well on my way to Vermont. As I backed my modest sedan out of Nathan's driveway, a strange sensation washed over me. Not just anger or hurt, but something unexpected: exhilaration. For decades, my life had followed a predictable pattern of work, quiet evenings with books, occasional visits with Nathan's family. Now, at 68, I was embarking on an adventure that would have seemed inconceivable just days ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. Nathan and Elise had seen me as an easy mark, a naive, trusting mother who could be easily manipulated and deceived. They had underestimated me profoundly, forgetting that librarians are essentially professional detectives, trained to follow information trails and uncover hidden truths. As I merged onto the highway heading north, I allowed myself a small, determined smile. They had made a critical error in their calculations. They had assumed I was merely a supporting character in their story. They were about to discover I was writing my own. Interstate 91 stretched before me like a ribbon of possibility, carrying me north through Massachusetts and into Vermont's green embrace. The familiar New England landscape, white church steeples, colonial homes, rolling hills just beginning to show spring's first blush, provided a deceptively normal backdrop for the most abnormal day of my life. I kept the radio off, preferring the clarity of silence to organize my thoughts. Uncle Walter had always been the family enigma, appearing at rare intervals throughout my childhood, always with unusual gifts and stories of his travels. My father had alternately described him as brilliant and impossible, a historian whose obsession with Revolutionary War artifacts had consumed his life. I remembered the last time I'd seen him, at my husband George's funeral 12 years ago. Walter had stood awkwardly at the periphery of the gathering, his tweed jacket patched at the elbows, his white beard neatly trimmed. He had pressed my hand and said something that seemed odd at the time. "You're the only one who inherited Frederick's intellect. Remember that when the time comes." Frederick was my grandfather, Walter's and my father's father, a professor of American history at Columbia. At the time, I'd attributed Walter's comment to grief-induced nostalgia. Now I wondered if it had been something more, a hint of his intentions perhaps. The Vermont welcome sign appeared, its Green Mountains logo, a familiar sight from childhood vacations. According to the GPS, I was just over an hour from Burlington, where Braddock and Sons maintained their offices. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the reality of what awaited me there, confirmation of both my inheritance and my son's betrayal, settled more firmly in my consciousness. I exited briefly at a rest stop, needing to stretch my legs and collect myself. The April air carried the crisp scent of pine and the earthy promise of spring. Standing beside my car, I called the dog walker to confirm she'd found my note and that the dogs were behaving. "They're fine, Mrs. Winters," Jenny assured me. "Though Winston seems to be looking for you. Keeps checking the bedrooms." The simple normalcy of dog behavior brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Thank you, Jenny. I should be home by evening." Back on the road, my thoughts turned to Nathan. What desperate circumstances had led my conscientious, honest son to conceive such an elaborate deception? The financial statements in the red folder showed catastrophic losses, but there was clearly more to the story. The Nathan I'd raised would have come to me for help before resorting to fraud. Elise's influence seemed the most likely catalyst. Since their marriage 8 years ago, Nathan had gradually adopted her materialistic values, her obsession with appearances. The modest home they'd first purchased had given way to the sprawling showplace they now occupied, complete with luxury cars and designer furnishings that seemed to multiply with each visit. But assigning blame wouldn't solve the immediate problem. I needed to secure my inheritance and then decide how to confront Nathan and Elise with what I knew. The thought of seeing disappointment replace the smug confidence in their eyes gave me no pleasure, only a bone-deep sadness that our family had come to this. Burlington appeared on the horizon, its small skyline nestled against the vast blue expanse of Lake Champlain. I followed the GPS directions to a stately brick building on Church Street, its brass plaque announcing Braddock & Sons Esther 1897. Generations of Vermont's wealthiest families had apparently entrusted their posthumous affairs to this establishment. After parking in the designated visitor's space, I checked my appearance in the rearview mirror. The face that looked back seemed different somehow. The same silver hair and laugh lines, but the eyes held a new resolve, a steeliness I'd never noticed before. I straightened my cardigan, grabbed the red folder, and headed inside. The reception area exuded old-world professionalism. Leather chairs, oriental rugs, oil paintings of stern-looking men who must have been the previous Braddocks. A young woman at an antique desk looked up as I entered. "May I help you?" "I'm Grace Winters. I have an appointment with Harrison Braddock." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "Of course, Ms. Winters. Mr. Braddock is expecting you. Please, follow me." She led me down a hallway lined with bookshelves, a sight that immediately put me at ease, to a corner office with windows overlooking the lake. Harrison Braddock rose from behind a massive desk as I entered. He was older than I'd expected, perhaps in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind eyes of someone accustomed to guiding clients through difficult transitions. "Ms. Winters," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming so promptly. Please have a seat." As I settled into the leather chair across from him, I removed my driver's license, passport, and social security card, placing them on the desk. "I brought the identification you requested." He nodded, examining each document carefully. "And do you have any family photographs? Something showing you with your father, or perhaps Walter himself?" I reached into my purse and extracted a small photo album I'd grabbed before leaving, my librarian's instinct for thorough documentation proving useful. "This is my father, James Winters, Walter's younger brother. And here's a photograph from my wedding, with Walter standing beside my father." Braddock studied the photographs, glancing between them and me. "Yes, the family resemblance is quite apparent, particularly around the eyes. You have the Winters eyes, as did Walter." He returned the photographs and identification, his expression shifting to one of greater concern. "Now, Ms. Winters, please tell me exactly how you came to learn of your inheritance and why you believe someone may be attempting to claim it fraudulently." I opened the red folder and laid out the documents one by one, explaining my discovery behind the bookcase, the timeline of deception, the planned impersonation. Braddock's expression grew increasingly grave as the full extent of the scheme became clear. "This is deeply disturbing," he said finally. "And you're certain the appointment scheduled for tomorrow was to include someone impersonating you?" "According to these documents, yes. Someone named Angela Weaver, apparently an impersonation consultant, whatever that means." Braddock steepled his fingers. "We occasionally encounter attempts at inheritance fraud, but rarely something this elaborate, and never involving close family members in quite this way." He paused. "Ms. Winters, given the circumstances, I believe we should contact the authorities." I shook my head firmly. "Not yet. I want to understand the full situation first. My son has clearly made terrible choices, but there must be more to this story." "As you wish," he conceded. "But you should know that what they've planned constitutes serious criminal fraud. If they proceed with bringing an imposter to this office tomorrow, the legal consequences could be severe. I understand. But before we discuss that, I'd like to know more about Uncle Walter's estate. This has all been such a shock that I haven't even had time to process what this inheritance actually entails. Braddock nodded, reaching for a thick file on his desk. Of course, Walter Edmund Winters left a very specific will with detailed instructions. He opened the file, revealing a photograph of a stately stone house nestled among trees. This is Winters Haven, the historic property that serves as the centerpiece of your inheritance. I stared at the image, memories stirring from childhood visits. I remember this place. We visited once when I was very young. It's one of Vermont's finest examples of federal period architecture, built in 1809 and meticulously restored by your uncle over the past 30 years. The property itself is valued at approximately $2.3 million. My breath caught. The numbers in the red folder suddenly became real. But that's just the beginning, Braddock continued, turning pages. The true value lies in what Walter collected and preserved within those walls. The true value, Braddock continued, lies in what Walter collected throughout his lifetime. He spread several photographs across the desk. Each showed rooms filled with antiques, display cases, and carefully preserved artifacts. Your uncle was much more than the eccentric recluse your family might have assumed. He was one of the foremost private collectors of Revolutionary War artifacts and 18th century manuscripts in the country. He simply chose to keep his collection private. I leaned forward, examining the photographs with newfound curiosity. Glass cases displayed ancient-looking pistols, yellowed documents in protective sleeves, maps with fragile edges. This collection has been quietly appraised at approximately $2.1 million, Braddock explained. It includes letters signed by Washington and Jefferson, original maps used during the Revolution, and first edition publications from the colonial era. My librarian's heart quickened. The value wasn't just monetary. These were irreplaceable historical treasures. Additionally, Braddock continued, Walter maintained investment accounts and liquid assets totaling just over $300,000, plus a trust fund established by your grandfather that has grown to approximately $1.8 million since its creation in 1952. The numbers were staggering. I had lived comfortably but frugally on my librarian's pension, occasionally worrying about future healthcare costs. Now, suddenly, those concerns seemed laughably distant. Walter was quite specific about his wishes, Braddock said, producing the will itself. The property and all its contents are to pass to you without restriction. However, he expressed his hope that the historical collection would remain intact and eventually be made available for scholarly research. Not a requirement, but a hope, I clarified. Exactly. He trusted your judgment completely. Braddock smiled slightly. He mentioned in our discussions that you were the only family member who shared his appreciation for historical preservation. He called you the keeper of knowledge. Unexpected tears pricked my eyes. I had barely known this man who thought so highly of me, who had entrusted me with his life's work. There's something else you should see, Braddock said, his tone shifting. He extracted a sealed envelope from the file. Walter left this personal letter for you. I was instructed to deliver it only after confirming your identity beyond any doubt. The envelope was heavy cream stationery, my name written in an elegant, old-fashioned script. I accepted it with trembling fingers. Would you like some privacy? Braddock offered. I nodded, and he discreetly left the office, closing the door behind him. Alone among the leather and mahogany, I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded 3 pages of handwritten text. My dear Grace, if you are reading this, then I have finally surrendered to time's inevitable march. Do not grieve. At 92, I have lived a full life, surrounded by the history and knowledge that sustained me after Ellen's passing. You may wonder why I've chosen you as the sole heir to everything I've built and preserved. The answer is simple. You understand the value of knowledge. From the time you were a small girl visiting Winters Haven with your father, I recognized in you the same curiosity that drove me throughout my life. You asked questions about the stories behind objects, not merely their worth. Your father, James, though a good man, never understood my passion for preservation. Your son, though intelligent, has chosen a path focused on acquisition rather than stewardship. You alone carry the true Winters intellectual legacy. There is, however, another reason for my decision, one your father never shared with you. Your grandfather Frederick established the Winters Trust in 1952, not merely as a family legacy, but as reparation. The initial Winters fortune, which funded your grandfather's education and eventual professorship, came from the sale of historical documents that were, to put it plainly, obtained through questionable means during the chaos following the Civil War. Frederick discovered this uncomfortable truth late in his life and established the trust as a way to eventually return these historically significant items to proper public access. I have spent my life expanding this collection, purchasing back original documents when possible, and creating a comprehensive archive that tells our nation's true story. The task of deciding this collection's ultimate home now falls to you. Museums will court you. Universities will make appealing offers. Private collectors will tempt you with extraordinary sums. Trust your judgment, as I have trusted it. One final note of caution. Wealth changes how others see you, rarely for the better. Be wary, even among family. Money reveals character. It does not create it. With deepest affection and confidence, your uncle, Walter Edmund Winters. I read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and returned it to its envelope. Walter's final warning seemed eerily prescient, considering what Nathan and Elise had already attempted. When Braddock returned, he found me composed but thoughtful. Walter mentioned the Winters Trust, I said, and something about my grandfather's concerns regarding how some historical items were originally acquired. Braddock nodded gravely. Yes, that's a delicate matter Walter discussed with me. The trust was established with specific ethical provisions about historical preservation and eventual public access. It's one of the reasons he was so particular about who would inherit the collection. And tomorrow, I said, redirecting our conversation to more immediate concerns, my son intends to bring an impostor here to claim all of this. Yes, which brings us to an important question. How do you wish to proceed? I considered my options carefully. The easiest approach would be to contact the police immediately, report the attempted fraud, and let legal consequences fall where they may. But that path would irreparably damage any hope of understanding or reconciliation with Nathan. I want to be here tomorrow, I said finally. When they arrive. Braddock looked surprised. You want to confront them directly? No, I clarified. I want to observe first. I need to see how far they're willing to take this deception with my own eyes. Can you arrange that? He considered for a moment. My office has an adjoining conference room with a one-way observation window. It's occasionally used when multiple family members are involved in estate discussions. You could watch the meeting without being seen. Perfect. The librarian in me appreciated the chance to gather information before taking action. And after I've seen enough, that would be your choice. We could involve the authorities, or you could confront them directly. Either way, I would ensure they leave with no access to your inheritance. I nodded. Decision made. Then I'll return tomorrow morning before their appointment. As we finalized the details, Braddock gave me a set of keys to Winters Haven. You might want to see the property while you're here. It is, after all, yours now. The weight of the keys in my palm made everything suddenly, tangibly real. I had come to Vermont expecting to prevent a fraud. I would leave as the owner of a historic estate and millions in assets. There's a caretaker on the property, Braddock added. Mr. Harris. He's been maintaining the house and grounds for 20 years and knew your uncle well. He can show you around if you'd like. The thought of seeing Winters Haven, my Winters Haven, was tempting. But the 4-hour drive back to Connecticut and the dogs awaiting my return took priority. Another time, I said, rising to leave. Right now, I need to get back before my son becomes suspicious. As I drove south through the deepening afternoon, the landscape blurred with my thoughts. Uncle Walter's letter, the historically significant collection, the family secrets, all of it demanded attention my mind couldn't fully provide while grappling with tomorrow's impending confrontation. By the time I pulled into Nathan's driveway, darkness had fallen. The house blazed with lights I hadn't left on, and an unfamiliar car sat beside mine. My heart raced as I approached the front door. Had Nathan and Elise returned early? Had my absence been discovered? I inserted my key with trembling fingers, bracing myself for confrontation. I stepped into the foyer, keys clutched like a weapon in my fist, and was immediately greeted by the familiar chaos of 3 excited poodles. Their enthusiastic welcome provided momentary relief. Surely if something were truly wrong, the dogs wouldn't be so relaxed. "Hello?" "Who's there?" I called, moving cautiously toward the kitchen where lights blazed. "Grandma Grace! In here!" The voice that answered belonged to Emma, my 24-year-old granddaughter, Nathan and Elise's only child. I hadn't seen her in months, not since she'd taken that research position at Boston University. "Emma?" I rounded the corner to find her at the kitchen island, laptop open, surrounded by stacks of papers. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun, and wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, the very image of a serious academic. "Surprise!" she grinned, rising to embrace me. "Dad mentioned you were dog-sitting, so I thought I'd drop by for a visit on my way back to Boston. The department meeting finished early, and I figured it'd be a nice chance to catch up without Mom's usual interrogation about my love life." She paused, noticing my expression. "Is everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I composed myself quickly, returning her hug. "Just surprised, that's all. I wasn't expecting company. The dog walker let me in. Hope that's okay." Emma gestured toward the papers strewn across the island. "I've been using the time to organize research notes for my dissertation, 18th century personal correspondence and its impact on revolutionary thought. Thrilling stuff, I know." The irony of her research topic, given what I'd just learned about Uncle Walter's collection, nearly made me laugh. "Actually, that does sound fascinating," I said sincerely, setting down my purse carefully, the red folder safely hidden inside. "How long can you stay?" "Just tonight, if that's all right. I need to be back in Boston by tomorrow afternoon." I busied myself making tea, using the familiar ritual to calm my racing thoughts. Emma's unexpected presence complicated matters. She couldn't know about my discovery or my trip to Vermont. Not yet, not until I'd confronted her parents. "So, Grandma," Emma said, accepting the steaming mug I offered, "where were you today? The dog walker mentioned you left a note about a doctor's appointment." The directness of the question caught me off guard. Like her father, Emma had always been observant, missing little. "Just a routine checkup," I lied, hating the deception, but seeing no alternative. "Nothing interesting." Emma studied me over the rim of her mug, her expression thoughtful. Must have been quite a drive. Your car was pretty warm when I arrived, like it had been on the road for hours." A librarian appreciates sharp observation skills, except when they're turned against her. Emma had clearly inherited my attention to detail. "I took the scenic route home," I said, forcing a light tone. "It was such a beautiful day. Sometimes I just like to drive and think." "About what?" she pressed, still watching me carefully. I hesitated, then decided a partial truth might satisfy her curiosity. "About your great-uncle Walter, actually. Did you ever meet him?" Emma shook her head. "I don't think so. Dad mentioned him occasionally. Some eccentric relative who lived in Vermont, right? I think he died recently." 6 months ago, I confirmed, observing her reaction carefully. Her expression registered only mild interest, no recognition. "I didn't realize you were close." "We weren't, really, but something reminded me of him today, and I found myself wondering about his life." I sipped my tea, then ventured further. "Has your father mentioned him lately?" "Not that I recall." Emma's attention had already drifted back to her research notes. "Though Dad and I haven't had much chance to talk lately. He and Mom have been so busy with work and travel." So Nathan hadn't shared the inheritance news with his daughter, another indication that the scheme was known only to him and Elise. This was somewhat reassuring. At least my granddaughter wasn't part of the deception. "How are your parents doing?" I asked casually. "They seemed a bit stressed when I last saw them." Emma shrugged. "Same as always. Mom's obsessed with renovating the pool house, Dad's working constant overtime. The usual keeping up with the Joneses lifestyle." She rolled her eyes affectionately. "Sometimes I wonder if they remember what they're working so hard for. If only she knew how accurate her assessment was, and how desperate their financial situation had actually become." We spent the next hour in comfortable conversation, Emma enthusiastically describing her dissertation research while I listened, genuinely interested despite the day's revelations weighing on my mind. Her passion for historical documentation reminded me powerfully of Uncle Walter's letter. The winter's intellectual legacy indeed lived on in this bright young woman. As the evening progressed, I realized Emma's presence was actually a blessing. Her unplanned visit provided the perfect explanation for my being awake and dressed early the next morning, ready to make the drive back to Vermont without raising suspicions with the dog walker. "I hope you don't mind an early breakfast," I told her, as we prepared for bed. "I have another appointment tomorrow morning." "Another doctor's visit?" she asked, that observant gaze still too perceptive for comfort. "Just some errands I need to run," I replied vaguely. "Nothing exciting." Later, lying in the guest room bed, I stared at the ceiling, planning the next day's events. I would need to leave by 6 to reach Burlington before Nathan and Elise's 10 o'clock appointment. I'd asked Braddock to arrange for me to arrive through a private entrance, ensuring I wouldn't be seen. The stakes had only grown higher with Emma's arrival. Whatever happened tomorrow would affect not just my relationship with Nathan and Elise, but potentially Emma's relationship with her parents as well. The revelation that they had planned to steal her grandmother's inheritance would devastate her. Yet I couldn't protect her from the truth forever. Secrets had already done enough damage to our family. In the darkness, I made a decision. After tomorrow's confrontation, regardless of the outcome, I would tell Emma everything about Walter's inheritance, her parents' deception, and most importantly, about the historical collection that aligned so perfectly with her academic interests. Perhaps some good could come from this painful situation. Perhaps Walter's legacy could inspire a new generation of the family he'd trusted me to shepherd. With that resolution made, I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, the red folder secure beneath my pillow, tomorrow's confrontation waiting like a storm on the horizon. Dawn had barely broken when I slipped out of Nathan's house, leaving a note for Emma explaining that my errands might take most of the day. The roads were nearly empty as I headed north again, my mind clearer than the day before, resolve strengthening with each mile. I reached Burlington by 9:30, following Braddock's texted instructions to park behind the building and enter through a service door, where his assistant waited to escort me discreetly to the conference room with its one-way observation window. "Mr. Braddock asked me to inform you that your son and his wife arrived in Burlington last night," the young woman whispered as she led me through the back corridors. "They're staying at the Hilton downtown, so they were already here, preparing for their performance." I wondered about the mysterious Angela Weaver, the impersonation consultant. Was she with them, receiving last-minute coaching on how to behave like me? The conference room was elegant but understated. Leather chairs surrounding a polished table, discreet recessed lighting, and one wall dominated by what appeared to be a large mirror, but was actually the observation window Braddock had mentioned. "You'll be able to see and hear everything," the assistant explained, "but they won't know you're here. Mr. Braddock will join you shortly before the meeting begins." Left alone, I arranged myself at the table facing the window, removed the red folder from my purse, and waited. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 10. Each minute brought me closer to witnessing my son's betrayal with my own eyes, something my heart still struggled to accept despite the evidence. At 5 minutes to 10, Braddock entered, his expression grave. "They've arrived," he said without preamble. "3 people, your son, a woman I presume is his wife, and an older woman who bears a passing resemblance to you." My stomach tightened. That would be Angela Weaver. Indeed. He took a seat beside me. "Ms. Winters, I must ask one final time. Are you certain you wish to proceed this way? We could still contact the authorities, prevent the fraud attempt entirely." I shook my head firmly. "I need to see it, Mr. Braddock. I need to understand how far they're willing to go." He nodded, though concern remained etched in his features. "Very well. I've instructed my associate, Mr. Pearson, to conduct the initial meeting. He'll establish their identities, review the inheritance details, and proceed as if everything were legitimate. I'll intervene when you've seen enough." "Thank you," I said, gratitude mixing with dread in my voice. A moment later, the door on the other side of the glass opened, and they entered. Nathan came first, impeccably dressed in the charcoal suit he reserved for important business meetings, his posture radiating confidence. Elise followed, elegant in a designer dress I'd never seen before, her blonde hair swept into a sophisticated updo. But it was the third figure that caught and held my attention, a woman approximately my age and build, with silver hair styled remarkably like mine, wearing a cardigan and skirt eerily similar to my own usual attire. Angela Weaver had studied me well. Had Nathan provided photographs beyond the one in the red folder? Had he described my mannerisms, my preferences, the way I typically dressed? The thoroughness of the deception made my blood run cold. A younger attorney, presumably Mr. Pearson, rose to greet them, shaking hands with each in turn. Mrs. Winters, he said, addressing Angela with professional courtesy, it's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. And Mr. Winters, Mrs. Winters, thank you for accompanying your mother today. Grace has been so anxious about finalizing everything, Nathan replied smoothly. We wouldn't dream of letting her handle this alone. The familiar voice speaking such calculated lies made my hands clench involuntarily beneath the table. Of course, Pearson continued, gesturing for them to be seated. Mrs. Winters, I'll need to verify your identity before we proceed. Standard procedure with estates of this magnitude. Angela nodded, reaching into a handbag that could have been mine. Certainly, she said, and I noted with a chill how she'd captured the slight New England inflection in my speech. I have my driver's license and passport right here. She produced documents that, from my vantage point, appeared authentic. Nathan had clearly obtained excellent forgeries. Everything seems to be in order, Pearson said after examining them. Now, as we discussed on the phone, your uncle Walter Edmund Winters left you his entire estate, valued at approximately $4.7 million. This includes the property known as Winters Haven, its contents, and various financial holdings. It's still so hard to believe, Angela said, affecting a modest demeanor that mimicked my own. Walter and I weren't particularly close. This came as quite a shock. A fortunate shock, Elise added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Indeed, Pearson agreed. Now, before we proceed to the formal transfer of assets, I do have one additional verification question. It's something only the real Grace Winters would know, part of the security protocol Mr. Braddock established with your uncle. I tensed, not having anticipated this development. Beside me, Braddock smiled slightly. A little improvisation, he whispered. Let's see how they handle it. Nathan shifted almost imperceptibly in his seat, while Elise's smile faltered. Angela, however, maintained her composure. Of course, she said calmly. What would you like to know? Pearson consulted a file before him. Mrs. Winters, could you please tell me the name of the book your Uncle Walter gave you on your 16th birthday? He mentioned it was significant in establishing your love of literature. A perfect question, specific, personal, impossible to research quickly. I held my breath, wondering how they would navigate this unexpected obstacle. Angela hesitated, looking momentarily toward Nathan, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. I believe, she said carefully, it was a first edition of Pride and Prejudice. Walter knew how much I admired Jane Austen. A plausible guess, but entirely wrong. Walter had given me a rare copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, inscribed with a note about finding one's own path that had indeed influenced my love of literature and eventual career choice. I see, Pearson said neutrally, making a note in his file. And one more question, if you don't mind. What was the name of your childhood cat, the one Walter referenced in his last letter to you? Another impossible question. I'd never owned a cat, being allergic since childhood, a fact Walter had certainly known. This time, Angela didn't look to Nathan for guidance. Mittens, she said confidently. A calico. I had her from age 7 until I left for college. Beside me, Braddock made a small note on his legal pad. The fabrication was now documented. The fraud attempt clearly established. Thank you, Mrs. Winters, Pearson said, rising from his seat. If you'll excuse me for just a moment, I need to retrieve the final documentation from Mr. Braddock's office. Please, make yourselves comfortable. As soon as the door closed behind him, Nathan leaned toward Angela. You did well, he said in a low voice that nevertheless carried clearly through the observation system. Just a few more signatures and it's done. The security questions were unexpected, Elise hissed. You said this would be straightforward. It's fine, Nathan assured her. They have no reason to doubt her identity. The documents look perfect. I'd seen enough. The pain of witnessing their calculated deception had transformed into cold clarity. I turned to Braddock. I'm ready. He nodded gravely, reaching for the phone on the conference table. Mr. Pearson, please ask Mr. Sullivan to join the meeting, and you may inform our guests that we have additional verification to complete. A moment later, the door to the other room opened again. This time, Braddock himself entered, accompanied by Pearson and a third man in a suit who remained by the door. Mr. and Mrs. Winters, Braddock said formally. And, he paused, looking directly at Angela, the woman claiming to be Grace Winters. I'm Harrison Braddock, the executor of Walter Edmund Winters' estate. Nathan straightened, professional smile firmly in place. Mr. Braddock, it's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Is there some problem with the paperwork? Not with the paperwork, Mr. Winters, Braddock replied calmly. The problem is that the woman sitting beside you is not your mother. The silence that followed Braddock's statement stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. I watched through the glass as Nathan's professional mask slipped, revealing a flash of panic before he recovered. I don't understand, he said, his voice admirably steady. This is my mother, Grace Winters. Elise's reaction was more telling. Her face had drained of color, eyes darting toward the door where the suit-clad man still stood like a sentinel. I'm afraid not, Braddock replied, his tone calm but unyielding. We have incontrovertible evidence that this woman is not Grace Winters, but rather someone hired to impersonate her. He turned to Angela, whose composure had noticeably faltered. Ms. Weaver, I believe? The impersonation consultant? Angela's shoulders sagged slightly, the carefully constructed persona crumbling under direct confrontation. This is absurd, Nathan protested, though with less conviction. What evidence could you possibly have? For one, Braddock continued, the real Grace Winters was able to correctly answer the security questions you just failed. For another, we have documented evidence of your plan, including receipts for Ms. Weaver's services and a rather detailed timeline of how this fraud was to be executed. Nathan's expression hardened. You're making serious accusations without any proof. I demand to speak with your supervisor, or better yet, our attorney. By all means, contact your attorney, Braddock said, sliding a phone across the table. In fact, I encourage it, as legal representation would be advisable given the situation. Mr. Sullivan here is a detective with the Burlington Police Department, and he has some questions regarding attempted inheritance fraud, a felony in the state of Vermont. The detective stepped forward, his presence suddenly more imposing. Mr. Winters, Mrs. Winters, and Ms. Weaver, I'd like each of you to remain seated while we sort this out. Elise finally broke her silence. Nathan, do something, she hissed, panic edging her voice. My son looked cornered, his confident facade crumbling. There must be some misunderstanding, he began, but the desperation in his tone betrayed him. It was time. I nodded to Braddock, who pressed the intercom button. Send her in, please. The door to their meeting room opened once more, and I walked in. The tableau before me would have been almost comical under different circumstances. 3 faces frozen in expressions of shock, disbelief, and horror. Angela Weaver actually gasped aloud, one hand flying to her throat as she stared at the woman she'd been paid to impersonate. Hello, Nathan, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Elise. Mom, Nathan whispered, the single syllable laden with confusion and dawning dread. How did I discover your plan to steal my inheritance? I finished for him, placing the red folder on the table. I found this behind your bookcase, after Coco knocked over a vase and the water leaked into your office. His eyes fixed on the folder, recognition and defeat washing over his features. You went through my private papers? He asked weakly, a pathetic attempt to reclaim moral high ground. Papers with my name and photograph on them? Yes, I did. I turned to Angela, who seemed to be trying to make herself invisible. You did an admirable job with the physical resemblance, but Walter would never have given me Jane Austen. He considered her work commercially acceptable, but intellectually pedestrian. Elise suddenly pushed back from the table. I want to speak with our lawyer before saying anything further. A wise decision, Detective Sullivan commented. Though I should inform you that we have enough evidence to pursue charges of attempted fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Charges? Nathan repeated numbly. Mom, you can't be serious. This is a family matter. A family matter? I echoed, allowing my hurt and anger to finally surface. You plotted to steal millions from me. You forged documents. You hired someone to impersonate me. At what point exactly did you think this was an acceptable way to treat your mother? Shame finally seemed to register on his face. We were desperate, he said softly. The investments failed. The market crashed. We were about to lose everything. So you decided to steal from me instead, I concluded, without even considering simply asking for help. Would you have given us millions? Elise challenged, her tone still defiant, despite her obvious fear. We'll never know, will we? Because you chose deception over honesty. I turned to Braddock. I'd like a moment alone with my son, please. Braddock hesitated. Ms. Winters, given the circumstances, just Nathan, I clarified. The others can wait outside with the detective. After a brief consultation with Sullivan, arrangements were made. Elise and Angela were escorted to separate waiting areas, each accompanied by a law enforcement officer. Nathan remained seated, looking diminished in his expensive suit, unable to meet my eyes. When the door closed behind the others, silence enveloped us. Through the observation window, I knew Braddock and Sullivan were watching, but this moment felt intensely private nonetheless, a reckoning between mother and son that had been building since I'd first discovered the red folder. "How long have you known about Walter's inheritance?" I asked finally. Nathan swallowed hard. 3 months. The law firm contacted me after failing to reach you directly. And you immediately decided to steal it rather than tell me about it? It wasn't immediate, he protested weakly. At first I was going to tell you, but then the Meridian investment collapsed and we lost everything. The house is mortgaged beyond its value. The cars are leased. Elise's business has been operating at a loss for years. So you decided I didn't deserve my own inheritance. It wasn't like that, he insisted. We were drowning, Mom. I couldn't see any other way out. And it never occurred to you that I might have helped willingly? That I might have shared with my only son if he'd simply been honest about his troubles? His silence was answer enough. Emma doesn't know any of this, does she? I asked. He looked up sharply. Emma? No, of course not. Why would you? She was at your house last night when I returned from Burlington. She's visiting from Boston. Panic flashed across his face again. Mom, please don't tell her about this. It would destroy her image of us. You mean it would reveal the truth, I corrected. Nathan, when did you become someone who values appearances over honesty? Who would rather commit fraud than admit financial failure? He had no answer, his gaze dropping to his hands clasped tightly on the table. The detective is waiting, I said after another long silence. There will be legal consequences for this, Nathan. I can't protect you from that, nor should I. Are you pressing charges? He asked, his voice barely audible. I haven't decided yet. I stood, suddenly exhausted by the weight of disappointment and betrayal. What happens next depends partly on what you do now, whether you accept responsibility or continue trying to justify the unjustifiable. As I moved toward the door, he finally looked up, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Mom, I'm sorry. I know that's inadequate, but I am. I got lost somewhere along the way. I don't even recognize myself anymore. It was the first genuine moment between us since this nightmare began. A glimpse of the son I'd raised, rather than the desperate man who'd plotted against me. It wasn't enough to erase what he'd done, but it was something to hold on to, a small flame of hope that perhaps, someday, we might find a way forward. I know, Nathan, I said softly. I don't recognize you either, and that's the most painful part of all this. I left him there, returning to the observation room where Braddock waited respectfully. What would you like to do now, Ms. Winters? He asked gently. I took a deep breath, my decision crystallizing. I want to see Winters Haven, today, before I decide anything else. The drive to Winters Haven took us through winding country roads lined with maple trees just beginning to bud. Braddock had offered to accompany me, perhaps concerned about my emotional state after the confrontation, but I had politely declined. This journey needed to be made alone. Detective Sullivan had taken formal statements from all parties, then released Nathan and Elise on their own recognizance, with strict instructions not to leave the state pending potential charges. Angela Weaver, apparently shaken by the seriousness of her involvement, had already begun cooperating with authorities, confirming that she'd been hired specifically to impersonate me. All of that seemed distant now, as I followed the GPS directions through increasingly rural landscapes. The property lay about 30 miles outside Burlington, nestled in the foothills of the Green Mountains. When I finally turned onto a narrow lane marked by an understated sign reading simply, Winters, my heart began to race with anticipation. The gravel drive curved through dense woods before suddenly opening to reveal a clearing, and beyond it, the house itself. The photograph in Braddock's office hadn't done it justice. Winters Haven was magnificent, a stately federal-style mansion built of local stone, 3 stories tall with symmetrical wings extending from the central structure. Dormer windows punctuated the slate roof, and mature oak trees stood sentinel on either side like ancient guardians. I parked in the circular drive and sat for a moment, absorbing the reality that this historic treasure now belonged to me. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. A retired librarian who had spent her career in a modest apartment, suddenly the owner of what could only be described as an estate. As I approached the wide front steps, the door opened before I could reach for it. A tall, weathered man in his 60s emerged, dressed in work clothes, his expression cautiously welcoming. "Ms. Winters?" he called. "Mr. Braddock telephoned to say you might be visiting today. I'm Edward Harris, the caretaker." "Mr. Harris, yes, thank you for receiving me without notice." He smiled, the expression warming his lined face. "No notice needed, ma'am. This is your home now." Walter made that very clear. The simple statement, "your home now," sent an unexpected thrill through me. Not just a property to manage or an inheritance to protect, but a home. "I'd be honored to show you around if you'd like," Harris offered. "I knew Walter for 20 years, helped him build the collection." "I'd appreciate that very much," I replied, following him into an entrance hall that took my breath away. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a space that managed to be both grand and welcoming. The original architectural details had been meticulously preserved: crown moldings, wide plank floors, a curved staircase with an exquisitely carved banister. But it was the contents that truly captivated me. Glass display cases lined the walls, each containing carefully arranged historical artifacts, documents under special lighting, small weapons, coins, and items I couldn't immediately identify. Between the cases hung oil paintings depicting Revolutionary War scenes and portraits of solemn-faced men in period clothing. Walter organized everything chronologically, Harris explained, leading me deeper into the house. The earliest artifacts are here in the entrance hall, primarily pre-revolutionary materials. The main collection is housed in what he called the archives room. We moved through a formal dining room and library, both beautiful but clearly secondary to Walter's true passion. Then Harris opened a set of double doors, revealing a room that would have made any museum curator envious. The archives room occupied the entire east wing of the first floor. A vast space with cathedral ceilings, custom-built display cases, and a state-of-the-art climate control system humming quietly in the background. The walls not covered by cases featured maps and documents in conservation frames. A massive table occupied the center of the room, its surface protected by glass, with research materials carefully arranged beneath. "Walter spent most of his time here," Harris said, his voice softening with respect, cataloging, researching, corresponding with historians and archivists around the country. Few people knew the extent of what he'd assembled. He was intensely private about the collection. I moved slowly around the room, overwhelmed by the historical significance of what surrounded me. Original letters signed by founding fathers, maps used during key revolutionary battles, diaries written by soldiers and citizens witnessing the birth of a nation. "Did he ever allow researchers to use these materials?" I asked, thinking of Emma and her dissertation. "Occasionally, but very selectively. He had concerns about preservation versus access, a balance he struggled with, especially in his later years." Harris gestured toward a leather-bound book on the central table. "That's the catalog, every item documented, with its provenance and historical significance." I gently opened the catalog, finding meticulous handwritten entries spanning hundreds of pages. Walter's dedication to historical preservation went far beyond mere collecting. This was a life's work, a scholarly endeavor of the highest order. "There's something else you should see," Harris said, leading me to a door at the far end of the archives room. Walter called this the legacy room. He spent much of his final year organizing it. The smaller room beyond was different from the others, more personal, less formal. A comfortable reading chair sat near the window overlooking the mountains. Bookshelves lined the walls, but instead of artifacts, they held leather-bound volumes and family photographs. At the center stood a desk that I recognized with a start. "That was my grandfather Frederick's desk," I said softly. "I remember it from childhood visits." Harris nodded. Walter wanted this room to connect the historical collection with the family history, the Winters legacy, as he called it. On the desk sat a single item, another red folder, similar to the one I'd discovered in Nathan's office, but older, the leather more worn. My name was written on it in Walter's distinctive handwriting. "He left instructions that you were to find this when you were ready," Harris explained, moving toward the door. I'll give you some privacy. Alone in the legacy room, I settled into the chair behind Frederick's desk and opened the folder with reverent care. Inside was another letter, dated just weeks before Walter's death, and a set of smaller envelopes. My dear Grace, if you are reading this in the legacy room, then you have accepted the responsibility I've entrusted to you. This second letter addresses what must happen next. The collection you've seen represents not just historical preservation, but historical justice. Many of these items were originally acquired through questionable means during the post-Civil War era, when my grandfather Jeremiah Winters purchased them from desperate Southern families at fractions of their value. Frederick discovered this troubling history and began the work of documentation and proper preservation as a form of restitution. I have continued and expanded this mission, but the final chapter must be written by you. The collection is too significant to remain private, yet too valuable to be carelessly dispersed. In the accompanying envelopes, you'll find 3 options I've researched extensively. Institutions worthy of receiving this legacy, each with different strengths and approaches to historical preservation and public access. The decision of which path to choose is yours alone. Whatever you decide, a portion of the trust has been set aside to ensure the collection remains intact and properly maintained. The house itself can be kept as a family home or incorporated into the legacy plan. Again, your choice entirely. Remember what I told you at George's funeral. You alone inherited Frederick's intellect. Now I see that you also inherited his integrity and compassion, qualities essential for this final task. With complete confidence in your judgment, Walter, I set the letter aside and examined the 3 envelopes. Each contained detailed proposals, one from the Vermont Historical Society, one from Harvard University's Research Library, and one from a newly established Historical Justice Foundation dedicated to connecting historical artifacts with their original communities. The weight of the decision pressed upon me, yet strangely, I felt equal to the task. Walter had seen something in me that perhaps I hadn't fully recognized in myself, a capacity for stewardship that transcended mere ownership. As I looked out the window at the mountains beyond, I thought of Nathan and Elise, of Emma, of the tangled relationships that had led to this moment. The inheritance that my son had tried to steal was never really about money or property. It was about legacy, responsibility, and trust. What would I do with this unexpected gift? How would I balance the competing needs of preservation, access, and family healing? The answers weren't immediately clear, but for the first time since discovering the red folder behind Nathan's bookcase, I felt a sense of purpose rather than betrayal. Winter's Haven wasn't just a house or a collection. It was a second chance, an opportunity to create meaning from the wreckage of broken trust. Harris knocked gently on the door, breaking my reverie. "Ms. Winters? It's getting late. Will you be staying the night? Your uncle's quarters are always kept ready for guests." I considered the offer, tempted by the peaceful surroundings after days of emotional turmoil. But Emma was waiting back at Nathan's house, unaware of the drama unfolding around her. And the dogs, of course, needed care. "Not tonight, Mr. Harris, but I'll be back soon. Very soon." Grace has discovered the true purpose of her inheritance, not just wealth, but a mission of historical preservation and justice. As she prepares to return to Connecticut, what decisions will she make about Nathan's fate, Emma's future, and the precious collection she now guards? Subscribe now for the final chapter of this powerful family drama. 6 months passed with the steady progression of seasons, spring yielding to summer, summer mellowing into autumn. The maple trees surrounding Winter's Haven now blazed with October glory, their red-gold canopies reflecting in the still waters of the small lake behind the property. I stood on the terrace, a cup of tea warming my hands against the morning chill, watching Emma direct the installation of new conservation lighting in the archives room. Her expertise had proven invaluable in implementing the decisions I'd made about Walter's collection. So much had changed since that fateful day I'd discovered the red folder behind Nathan's bookcase. The path forward had not been easy, requiring difficult choices, painful conversations, and ultimately, a complete reimagining of our family's future. My first decision had been about Nathan and Elise. After consulting with both Braddock and Detective Sullivan, I had chosen not to press criminal charges on 2 conditions: complete financial transparency and mandatory community service. Nathan had accepted these terms with humble gratitude. Elise had initially resisted, but eventually complied when faced with the alternative of prosecution. The consequences had unfolded naturally. Their marriage, already strained by financial desperation, could not withstand the added pressure of exposed deception. 3 months after the confrontation in Braddock's office, they had separated. Nathan moved into a modest apartment, took a position teaching finance at a community college, and began the slow work of rebuilding his integrity. Elise returned to her family in California, her carefully constructed social facade in tatters. Emma had been devastated upon learning the truth, but her resilience surprised us all. After her initial shock and anger, she had thrown herself into helping me establish what we now called the Winters Historical Trust, a foundation dedicated to making Walter's collection accessible to researchers while maintaining its historical integrity. "Grandma," Emma called from the terrace doorway, breaking my reverie. "The conservation specialist is here. She wants to discuss the document rotation schedule." "Coming," I replied, taking a final glance at the autumn landscape before turning back to the practical matters at hand. Inside, Winter's Haven hummed with purposeful activity. The decision I'd ultimately made about Walter's collection had been a hybrid approach, keeping the collection intact at Winter's Haven while establishing it as a limited-access research center affiliated with both Harvard University and the Vermont Historical Society. The first group of carefully vetted scholars would arrive next month, marking the official opening of the center. I had moved permanently to Winter's Haven in July, after arranging for my apartment to be sublet to a young librarian from my former workplace, a fitting continuation. Emma had taken a sabbatical from her doctoral program to serve as the Trust's first academic director, her dissertation now focused on the very collection she helped curate. In the newly renovated conference room, formerly a rarely used formal dining room, Dr. Abigail Chen from the Conservation Department at Harvard waited with diagrams and preservation plans. At 35, she brought contemporary expertise that complemented Walter's meticulous but sometimes outdated preservation methods. "Mrs. Winters," she greeted me warmly. "Emma and I were just discussing the rotation schedule for the Washington correspondence. With proper climate control and limited exposure, we can make these letters accessible without compromising their condition." The meeting proceeded efficiently, another step in transforming a private collection into a resource for historical scholarship. As we concluded, Emma mentioned casually, "Dad called this morning. He's finished the catalog digitization project and wants to know if we need him for the Jefferson papers next week." I nodded, a complicated mix of emotions stirring at the mention of Nathan. His involvement with the Trust had begun as part of his mandated community service, cataloging and digitizing the collection's inventory. But over months of steady work, something had shifted. The genuine historian's passion that Walter had noted in our family line had awakened in Nathan, providing him with purpose beyond material acquisition. "Tell him yes," I replied. "Those papers will need careful attention." After Dr. Chen departed, Emma and I took our lunch on the terrace, enjoying what might be one of the last warm days before winter's arrival. "The grant proposal is almost finished," she mentioned between bites of her sandwich. "If it's approved, we can expand the educational outreach program to include virtual tours for schools that can't afford field trips." I smiled at her enthusiasm. Walter would have approved. He always said history shouldn't be locked away from those who need it most. "Speaking of locked away," Emma said, her tone shifting to something more tentative. "Mom called yesterday, from California." My eyebrows raised in surprise. Elise had maintained minimal contact since the separation, communicating with Nathan only through attorneys and with Emma only on rare occasions. "She wants to visit," Emma continued. "Says she's been doing therapy, reconsidering her priorities, wants to apologize in person." "Do you believe her?" I asked carefully. Emma shrugged. "I'm not sure, but I'm willing to listen." Her capacity for potential forgiveness reminded me forcefully of a decision I'd made early in this journey, to allow the possibility of redemption, even after profound betrayal. It wasn't about forgetting or excusing, but about creating space for change, however unlikely it might seem. "Your mother will always be welcome here," I said, meaning it despite our history. "This place is about preservation, after all, not just of artifacts, but of human connections worth saving." Emma reached across the table to squeeze my hand, understanding the layers in my response. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the legacy room, seated at Frederick's desk as I often was when contemplating important decisions. The red folder, both Walter's original and my own version where I documented our family's recent history, lay open before me. A knock at the door announced Harris, who had stayed on as caretaker and become a trusted friend. "Mr. Braddock is here for your quarterly meeting, Ms. Winters. Shall I show him in?" "Please do," I replied, gathering my notes. Braddock entered with his customary formal courtesy. Though our relationship had warmed considerably over the months of working together to establish the trust. "The financial statements are quite encouraging," he reported after preliminary greetings. "The trust's investment portfolio is performing well, and the restricted access model has attracted significant grant funding. Your uncle would be pleased." "I think he knew all along what this place could become," I said, glancing at the family photographs that lined the bookshelves. He just needed someone who shared his vision. Our meeting covered the practical matters of endowments and operational costs, but as Braddock prepared to leave, he paused, his expression softening. "If I may say so, Ms. Winters, you've accomplished something remarkable here. Many in your position, after what your son attempted, might have chosen a very different path." I considered his words, thinking of the various crossroads I'd faced since discovering Nathan's betrayal. How easy it would have been to press charges, to cut him from my life entirely, to harden my heart against the possibility of reconciliation. "The true inheritance wasn't the property or the money," I said finally. "It was the responsibility to preserve what matters, both historically and personally." Walter understood that. I think I do now too. As Braddock departed and twilight settled over Winter's Haven, I made my evening circuit of the property, a habit I'd developed since moving in. The archives room with its treasures, the newly renovated research spaces, the living quarters where Emma had taken up residence in the West Wing. My final stop was always the small sitting room that had become my favorite retreat. Unlike the grander spaces, this room held my personal treasures, my books, photographs of George, of Nathan as a child, of Emma throughout her growth, and now, prominently displayed on the wall, a newly commissioned family portrait, Emma, Nathan, and myself, photographed in the library of Winter's Haven. Not a perfect family, certainly, not unmarked by betrayal and pain, but a family working toward something meaningful, something that transcended individual failings. I settled into my chair with a book, at peace with the knowledge that legacies are never simple. They're composed of triumphs and failures, wisdom and mistakes, damage and healing. Walter had entrusted me with his legacy, understanding that preservation isn't about freezing the past in amber, but about creating something living from what history provides. My son had tried to steal an inheritance, never realizing that its true value lay not in bank accounts or property deeds, but in the opportunity to contribute to something larger than ourselves. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest gift I could offer him, not forgiveness without accountability, but a chance to be part of a legacy worth building. Outside my window, the maple leaves continued their brilliant autumn dance, each one unique, each one temporary, each one part of a cycle of renewal that had continued long before us and would persist long after, like family, like history, like the stories we choose to preserve and the futures we dare to imagine. The Winter's legacy continues, transformed by Grace's wisdom and compassion. Thank you for following this emotional journey of betrayal, forgiveness, and the discovery that true inheritance lies not in what we possess, but in what we choose to preserve. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below.